So I thought I'd give a little quick overview. This is just an entry-level discussion. We're not going to go into like the deep topics. We're not going to go into other libraries. We're just talking about React and sort of how React's laid out. So what I'll do though is, I know everybody's heard about React. It's been out for a while now. I'll leave a little bit of time at the end, and anybody can ask any questions if y'all want to just talk about something, just to say, okay, I heard this or heard that. We can talk about it.
Are you talking about Redux at all?
No. So I'm not covering Redux. I'm not covering Flux. I'm not going to give you that. But if you want, I can put together another topic and we can talk about that. Okay. So if you want to ask some questions at the end, feel free. If you want to stop me anytime, feel free. If it's a big discussion, I'll probably defer that to after this meeting, or we can have another lunch and learn on that. Okay. So what is React? So a lot of times you'll hear people say that it's the V in MVC. More accurately, it's probably better described as JavaScript used to compose your DOM hierarchy. So there's no model and there's no controller unless you define one. So it's kind of up to you. We're just talking about the view and just creating the hierarchy. So the biggest concept when you're talking about React are components. It's all about components, and it's all about composing components. And those components are what render out your DOM hierarchy. So what does that mean? It's a lot of words. So most of this talk is going to be in the code. So let's get into the code and we can start going over what components are. So right here, what I have highlighted is a component. It's pretty much the simplest component you can have. I'm using the class syntax, which this is ES6, so I'm just extending the app class with a the component type, and that gives us some special functions. In one case, we've got render as a function as part of the lifecycle, and we can talk about that a little bit. But render, all it does is it gets called when the component is created on the screen. And what it'll do is it'll return the element, in this case H1. So it's just going to take this element that's being created right here, and it's going to render out your HTML for you and put it on the page. Okay. So the syntax for this thing is you've got the name of the element, you've got some data that gets passed in, and we're going to definitely talk about this, and you've got the like the text that's going to be used, or any subcomponents that get passed into the element. So this is really simple. This is the basic thing, and this is what you see over here. Is you see the hello world. So if I were to come over here and change this, so we're going to use React.loading. It's going to update immediately. Okay. So that's all great. But let's get into a little bit more. So let's say we want to add some more elements. We'll add in create element, and we'll add in, let's say, a span tag. We'll follow the same kind of pattern. We'll call it a spanner. Add another element. Okay. So that right there is just rendering all that stuff to the page for me. Okay. So if we went and looked at this HTML, you'd see regular old HTML, and you'd see this structure right here, this hierarchy, H1 span, and div would be within span. Yeah.
So the create element takes a callback, you have a callback in it. Is that what you're doing there? Yeah, take a second.
Yeah. It's I think this accepts an array of elements, so it's accepting all three of those as different elements in that array. It's just arguments that are getting passed in. Yeah. That's a component. That's a component arranged with subcomponents. So now we've got like this DOM hierarchy that gets rendered out. And this is nice. It's okay. but it's really verbose. I mean, we've got a lot of code here, and all we're really doing is spitting out HTML. So what they provide for us is JSX. So what JSX is, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard about this, JSX is, all it is syntactic sugar that takes this React create element language right here, and it just converts that into something that looks a lot more like HTML that you're used to, okay? So we'll convert this right now to a component with JSX. So let me this comment. Okay, so all this is, I'm going to do this really fast as I can.
What does the React create element do that's different than normal create element? Just create element.
So what it's really doing is there's a lot of behind the scenes in terms of the data that's getting passed in. It's rendering out the hierarchy here for the other elements that are getting passed in. It's converting this tag, this component into the actual script. So really this right here is another component. So H1 is a component, span is a component, div is a component. We'll write our own component in a minute so you can see how that gets put together. But we don't actually have to build out the string that's going to render. We're going to build on top of the React components that already exist. And then tools like Babel and TypeScript will take these elements and it'll convert it into the string version of the component. In this case, it's going to be like, an H1 tag or whatever. Okay. So I hope I'm doing this right because this is a little bit different than a practice. So we'll see how this looks.
Don't you have to wrap it all in ticks?
Nope.
No.
Not anymore.
JSX is a publicly accepted spec now.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, I mean, and the thing is, it looks like DOM components, but it never is. Because, like, React actually constructs the stuff in memory.
To Brian's question, you're still building a DOM, it's just who owns that DOM. With document create element, the browser owns the DOM. With React.create element, it's the React shadow DOM.
All this is still the same. This is exactly the same as up here, and I'll show you that this is actually rendering. So it's still rendering out here. Get rid of some of this. Verbose. All right. So same thing as this. At the end of the day, when you run it through Babel or the TypeScript compiler, it's going to basically, it's going to take these JSX elements and it's going to turn them into these React create elements on the back end. And then that's when React kicks in and it converts this thing into an H1 string. So you'll have like this, it's creating the HTML code for you. Okay, so that's JSX. I mean, it's really just syntax. So I told you that we would create our own component, so let's do that now. Because right now we're just piggybacking off of React's components. But the way our component would look, if we were to do this, is class my component, extends component, and we're going to create the render function. Every component has a render function in it because that's ultimately what you're trying to do is spit something out. And we'll put a div tag in here, and we'll say,
Using components for base class, can you extend other components too? Like H1 or something?
I'm sure you could, but I think the idea would be that you would compose the H1 component within. I'm not sure actually how that would work. But everything is about composition with React, like you're trying to put everything together. So we've got this thing. All I have to do here is I'll just go my component, close the tag, and it blew up somehow. Extends component. spell that right.
Your render's not returning it.
Yeah, you're not.
Ah, see? That's what happens. Still not returning. Is it blowing up now?
Did Webpack stop?
Yeah, probably. This is my component.
Yeah, some things the hot module ruler.
Yeah, it'll freak out sometimes. So, here we've got our own component. It's nice. It's okay. But really all we're interested in is this div tag right here. It would be nice if I didn't have to write all this other stuff. I mean, there's nothing else happening. It's not magic. It's just a div tag. So we can reduce this and we can use what's called a stateless function. So they've got this additional syntax once they introduce the ES6 language elements into this. So what you can do is you can say, well, you can comment this thing out. You can create bar my comment equals this, and then we can just take this div right here, and we can stick it in there. And that's the same thing, once again, like we can, prove it to you, hopefully. So, it's all there, right? So what's cool about this is, since there's no logic associated with this, it's stateless. I mean, it's not going to actually do anything, okay? So it's nice to have this option to have this simpler syntax. But then the question comes up, well, that's awesome. Can all my components also kind of follow the same syntax? And we just make all our components stateless, right? So the idea is, if you could, you should, but it's kind of hard to do that. I mean, at some point, you're going to have to capture some state. Case in point, let's say you want to get some data back from the server, and you want to render that data to the screen. Well, where's that data going to come from? So how are you going to deal with that, that data coming back? Or let's say two components are connected to each other somehow. You want a button to fire on one component, you want the other component to hear it, to capture that button click event. You're going to need some state internally to be able to keep up with anything that comes in. So, how would you create so that's when you get two types of data structures. So you get props and state. So, so props and state, that's your component's data, and so props are used for data that gets passed in. State is used for changes in the data. So props never change, they just get passed in constantly. So if you were to think of your component as being more like a function, you would say, to use the metaphor of a function, you would say props were like arguments that get passed in, and state is like internal variables within your function. So you would want to change the internal variables, like you've got a for loop or something like that. You're changing all that stuff within your function. Nothing outside the function knows about your internal state. And that's kind of what state is in this case. Props are arguments that come in, and I'll show you how all that gets wired up. So we're going to pass some props in right now to my stateless component. So what we'll do is we'll pass in some props here, and we will use those props in a second. So what you would do here is you would go, we're going to just define something. Like I called it text, I could call it whatever I want, and I'm going to pass in something else, whatever. And then I'm going to use this syntax, the single curly brace syntax, to display my props. Props dot text. And what that's going to do is what's happening is we define this, whatever this name is. That name gets passed in. It gets collected with anything else that we would put on our component. It gets put into a JSON object. That JSON object gets injected as props, and then the props, we can access any of those properties that we put on our JSON object. Okay? So that's pretty great. Earlier, I don't know if you guys noticed, but when we were doing the create element, I told you that this is data that gets passed in. These are the props. So like, let's say we were going to render, we weren't going to use JSX, and we were just going to go with the JavaScript version of this, okay? then we could write this out. We could write our props in here. We would do text : hey instead of this syntax that I use down here at the bottom for my component, right? Same thing, and when it gets rendered out by Babel or the TypeScript compiler, it's going to do just that. It's going to put all that together for you in JavaScript. Okay. So next up are your stateful components. So now let's say we do want some state. We have a situation where we want to listen for events from the server. We want components to talk to each other. Then how do we write a stateful component? Well, really, we already sort of have a stateful component in this syntax right here. We just have to start wiring up any data that we want, stick stuff in a state as we need it. So let's do that real quick. First thing you do is you create a component did mount function. So component did mount it's another part of the component lifecycle. So both the render and the component did mount are part of that lifecycle. There's a handful of other ones. There's not a lot. And that's kind of what makes React so attractive, is the API for these components is actually pretty simple. So you've got your component did mount, and what we're going to do is we're going to put in the window.onResize event in here. So here's my goal. What I want to do is I want to display the width and height of the window every time the window gets resized. Okay, so how would you do that in JavaScript? You use the onResize event, you apply a function to it, you capture window.inner width and inner height, and you would spit that out on the screen somehow. So that's what we're going to do right now, and we're going to piggyback off of the fact that React's going to help us a little bit with that rendering, so we don't have to do any of that. So first thing we do on resize, we're going to set up a function, lambda. It's going to take, it's going to call this set state. Okay, so what's going to happen here? So window on resize, that's provided by the browser. That's not anything that's React specific. Set state is passed in, or it's part of the component class. So we get the ability to set the internal state of whatever the component is. And what you do is you pass in a JSON object. So in this case, we're going to pass in height. We're going to do window.inner height. We're going to pass in width and window.inner width. So now we've got our state, but we want to do something else. We want to default this state because we want to use this state. And component did mount, when this method gets called in the lifecycle is after the component's already been rendered to the screen. So the component gets rendered to the screen, and then it fires that event, and then it'll bind that event in there. So what we'll do is we'll call the constructor. We'll set up a constructor. We'll call super, and we'll pass in our props to the base, and then we'll set the default state. Equals, and what we'll do is we'll just copy this, because at the end of the day, we want the original width and height of the window. So now we've got our default state, we've got some state in here, so what we want to do now is pass it into our component. And so we go height equals this dot state dot height, width equals and so that's awesome. So we're passing these into the component now, but we also want to handle those props in the component. Before we were handling the text. So let's create a hierarchy. So we can say, well, we want these to be in div tags. So we'll stick a div. And I'm pretty sure right now, I think that's all we need, but I'm pretty sure for some reason, oh, I know why. What's that?
think on line 25, don't you pass props to constructor? For CSS.
Oh, yes, you're right. That's actually a great point. So I wanted to point that out. So you pass in the props to the constructor here. This is the equivalent of doing this. So our stateful component could accept prompts too, but it could still have internal state. So it's not one or the other. You can mix and match how these data elements work together. In this case, we don't have any props that are coming into the app, but we could. We're just not using them. But we're just defining them here just in case somebody does want to pass props in when they reuse this component. Okay, and I think that's it, and I'm pretty sure that this will not refresh. And the reason this won't refresh, it took me a minute to realize, is that this fires after the component's been mounted to the screen, which it already has, so this never executes the second time, so we've got to refresh the page in this case. So we've got the width and height, so hopefully this thing will work. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. Yeah, there it is. So what's happening here is we bound this event, we set the state of this component. When the state changes, anytime the resize occurs, then the component will re-render. When we call set state, the component re-renders. As soon as that happens, we're just going to pass the state into our component, and our component's just going to, it's a dumb component. It's going to be like, oh, you gave me something. I'm going to render that. So that's pretty much it. I mean, the four, key takeaways, the basic introduction to React is going to be components, JSX, state, and props. And that's pretty much it. I mean, that's in entry level right there. So any questions? Want to talk about anything?
Can you kind of walk through this maybe one more time of the exact life cycle, like starting when the class starts, it calls this constructor, and then it calls this.
Okay.
Like it's called.
Yeah, we can do that. So let's start from our index.html. We'll start from the very beginning. Okay. So the first thing, you guys are familiar. You're going to hit your JavaScript, and it's going to call whatever JavaScript you have that's in global scope. Okay. In this case, what's in global scope is in this index.js. Both of these things got bundled. App.js and index.js got bundled into bundle.js. So both of these are in there. First thing it's going to do is call this React DOM render. What React DOM render does is it's going to say, hey, you've given me this component. I'm going to walk through the hierarchy, and I'm going to generate a string. It's just an HTML string. And it's going to take that, and it's going to bind it to this root element in the HTML. That's just a div tag. Okay? So next thing that happens is we went to render app. Okay. So as soon as we hit the app, it's going to, like you said, it's going to call the constructor, it's going to call the base and pass in props. It's going to take the state and it's going to default it. In this case, we're just saying, okay, we're taking whatever's in the window, we're going to set the inner width and the inner height. Now, what happens next is what actually happened before the constructor fired was that it rendered the React string. It took whatever came out of index.js and it just rendered that to the page. And it just spit it out there. It doesn't have any data in it yet, okay? All it's going to do is say, I'm just going to spit some stuff out, and then it's going to run again. It's going to say, well, now it's going to hit the constructor. Now it's going to go through the life cycle. And that's when you get the state. It'll re-render. It'll put the inner inner width and inner height, and re-render just this component. Like if this component was like a subcomponent of a bunch of other components, it would only re-render that. Okay. So then what happens is it sticks that on the screen, it hits component did mount, because now you've actually got the HTML on there. And it's going to call set state. Because the state changed, it's going to re-render again. When it re-renders again, it's going to set state, it's going to take this data, it's going to capture that, it's going to re-render again, it's going to re-render all of these components within this app. It's not going to, it's going to re-render the whole DOM tree of everything that's underneath the root element that changed. So if we've got a DOM tree with like multiple nodes and multiple levels, you might only change one part of the DOM tree, and when you call set state on that one part, it's going to re-render everything under it. In this case, this is really simple, so it's re-rendering the root node, which is app. Does that make sense? So then, once it does that, it's going to take this state for height and width, and it's going to pass those into my component, which is going to get re-rendered as well. And it's just going to take whatever values got passed in, just the JSON object, and it's going to apply those to the text. So then you're just re-rendering again, and it's displaying everything on the screen.
So it kind of automatically watches variable changes like Angular does?
It's not watching variable changes, it's watching when prompts and state changes. So anytime you call, like in this case, when you call set state, it re-renders the DOM tree associated with this element, everything below. Okay. So if we were to pass in something, let's say we had a function and the function was returning, and it was returning new values into props, then it would re-render as well because prompts changed.
I think a story that really highlights the purpose of React is where it came from. Facebook was having trouble syncing all of their chat indicators in their app. You know, the globe, the number, your chat window, and all of this. And they kept trying to find a way to get all of them in agreement. So they invented React as like a way that you can have a single event. It will cascade down to as many places that are listening for that at the same time. They will all re-render without you ever telling it. And so that's sort of the function of this, is that state is like, so in that instance, the state would be your chat count. And so that globe is a component that's also watching that chat cloud. Your chat window is something that's watching that. And so all of a sudden, with one event broadcast, you have two disparate DOM nodes that are almost non-relational be able to update, and all of their child components are able to update. And all of that is happening in whenever it needs to. And so that's where your Facebook news wall comes from. This is what React is doing, is as you scroll down, it's literally reaching in and re-rendering your entire newsfeed DOM.
Right, and so there's a whole lot of technology that goes into making this work, and we don't need to go into the technology, but you'll go and you'll read about virtual DOM. We can talk about the virtual DOM. I only know so much about it because it's kind of like pretty complicated from my understanding. But at the end of the day, all we care about is when does our DOM get re-rendered, and that's when set state gets called in the process.
Can you have the HTML in a separate file and reference it as a template?
Not exactly. That's kind of what these dummy components are. So like I could stick this into a separate file and import it in, which that's what you see a lot of times. You'll see every component will have its own file. So you'll have this thing, and it'll have props that get passed in, and that's all it does. There's no code associated with it.
So I mean, as far as to Sam's point about the eventing, like Angular has the same event where you can have something on root scope that pulls all the way down and updates all the scopes. So I guess I'm failing to see why React somehow is better or worse, or like what the specific use case is.
Yeah, I was wondering about the use cases too. It seems like it's a lightweight alternative to Angular without MVC.
So I think we could probably have a long discussion about this. So all I'll say is that what React does is it tries to bring in more of a functional paradigm. What you're thinking about is just what's in your component. So you don't really care about the way that anything else works outside. You're registering to whatever events you're interested in, and you're rendering whatever you want to render for this component. And then you put that component aside, and you start working on other components.
So it's fully
So-
encapsulated.
Exactly. So you have like this decoupling I mean, and it's a proper decoupling between components. Now, as with anything, there are going to be pros and cons, and I think we could probably have a long discussion if anybody wants to stick around and we can talk about it. It's probably outside the scope of the presentation.
The other main difference is just the one-way data flow as opposed to the data binding. Which
Right.
is two-way.
Right. So what Sapir is referencing is to make this work, like I said, this is the view in MVC. Well, to make all these like events fire, they introduced an architecture called Flux, which is based on event sourcing. So basically you have events that are being fired in a one-way path, that you've got data coming from your components and coming back to other components. That architecture is something we could talk about outside of this, because there's a lot of technologies and ideas behind how that works. But needless to say, all it really comes down to is I might click a button here and raise an event, and somehow behind the scenes, other components are going to hear that event. And so you can have some changes.
Because it's encapsulated, can you take a ReactJS component and stick it into, or as part of, or I don't know how you do it, into an Angular component that
Yeah.
has an Angular component?
Yeah, I mean, like you're going to render out this HTML. So like if I wanted to, I could do all the, ng dash whatever properties on my components and just have that render out. And then it's going to do all that stuff.
And Angular will pick that up. You just have to wait till it's actually rendered to the tree.
Yeah. And early on, there was discussion about, because there are a lot of Angular applications out in the wild. So one of the suggestions is React isn't going to take over everything for you. You can use it in conjunction with other frameworks. The idea is if you want to slowly migrate off of those frameworks onto React, you can do it by doing something like that, and just using both at the same time.
There are quite a few people out there who are actually using React and Angular 1 applications to just replace directives, because directives are a pain in the butt.
Right. And that's what I was going to say early on. Is that's what the components really are. It's just another approach the way directives work. But instead of directives being like a second-class citizen in Angular, it is the primary citizen in React, and everything comes from that. But the API for it is a lot simpler than directives. I don't know if you guys have read the directive API. It is really tough, but this is pretty simple. I mean, the whole API for this thing is a page for the component.
The also other primary purpose when you work with other companies is when you're worrying about page rank, particularly now on mobile, your page speed is incredibly important. The shadow DOM is sometimes twice as fast as Angular, because Angular is still reading real DOM nodes. So the shadow DOM is just insanely fast.
Is it more consistent between browsers too?
Yes, I know. So the thing is, particularly for listing sites and people where now Google's penalizing you for page speed, you can sometimes double your page speed by using React, because that shadow DOM is just so much faster of getting content.
And so all these things, I mean, there's a lot of benefits to React. There's cons, there's pros, there's cons with everything. It's probably the most stable framework right now when you compare it to, Angular 1 is probably going to start to dwindle now that Angular 2's out. Angular 2 is probably not as stable as you want it to be. So it's a good framework. It's fun to work in once you kind of wrap your mind around the new paradigms and that sort of thing. But I think we've run out of time, so if y'all want to stick around, ask any other questions, have discussion, we can do that. But I appreciate it. Thank you all.
Thank